Okay, let's really dig into a specific and pretty dramatic legal situation today. Imagine you're running a smaller company, maybe an air transport service. You land this huge, really important contract with a big project manager. Let's call them RCA. But see, RCA is working for an even bigger fish, the main client, Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. You know how it is, that contract with RCA. It's definitely your lifeline. Now, Alyeska, the client pulling the strings up top, they decide, they don't like you much. Maybe you had a nasty dispute over money before. Maybe you even, sued them and won. So Alyeska then goes and uses a perfectly legal, written down right they have in their contract with RCA. And doing that forces RCA to, well, cut you loose, terminate your contract. Now, on paper, Alyeska is just, managing their massive pipeline project. Seems fine. But when does using a contractual right stop being just smart business and start being a legal act? A tort designed to basically punish someone. So our mission for this deep dive, we're getting into the weeds of intentional interference with contract, or IS. We're going to really analyze that super fine line between having a legitimate reason of privilege and just acting out of malice, using this really key case, Alyeska Pipeline Service Co. v. Aurora Air Service.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you've got this tension, right? The law needs to let huge companies like Alyeska run these massive, complex projects efficiently. They need that freedom. But at the same time, it has to protect smaller outfits like Aurora from, well, getting crushed just because someone higher up has a grudge. So what we'll do is first lay out the basic legal ingredients for this tort. Then we'll look at how these rules work, even if the contract could be ended easily, like at will. And then we'll use the Alyeska case, frame by frame almost, using FRAC, to really nail down this idea of predominant purpose and also how the whole burden of proof thing plays out in these kinds of fights.
Okay, let's start at square one. What's the fundamental rule? For you listening, what actually makes a third party, someone outside the contract, liable for messing with it?
Well, the general rule is pretty straightforward, actually. You've got a legal claim against the third party if they intentionally get one party to breach or end their contract with another party. The key addition, though, is without justification or privilege. So it's intentional interference, sure, but it has to be unjustified. That's the heart of it.
Okay, here's a classic curveball, though. What if the contract they interfered with, the one that got terminated, had like an optional termination clause? It was basically terminable at will. I mean, if RCA could have ended the contract with Aurora anytime anyway, why should Alyeska interfering even be illegal wrong?
Right, that's a really critical point. And most courts, they say, yes, absolutely, you can still sue for unjustifiable interference even with an at-will contract. Why? Because the harm isn't just the breach itself. It's messing with the ongoing relationship, the expectation that things will continue. Every day that contract is running, both sides expect it to keep going. The interferer destroys that expectation, that potential future business. And that's a real economic loss, even if the contract could have been ended for other reasons.
Got it. Okay, let's shift to the defense side. Alyeska, they argued they had really strong reasons, economic efficiency, safety concerns along the huge Trans-Alaska pipeline. Sounds like a powerful privilege to make changes. So how does the law decide if a reason is good enough? What's the standard for justifying interfering with someone else's deal?
Okay, so justification isn't easy to prove. You basically have to show that the interest you were trying to protect, maybe your own financial stability, public safety, efficient project management, whatever, is actually more important socially than the contract interest you messed up. It's a balancing act, a pretty high bar. And this is crucial, this privilege, it's not absolute. You lose it, it's forfeited if you weren't acting in good faith to protect that legitimate interest. If your main goal, your real motive, was just to hurt the other party, then the privilege disappears, even if you had some plausible business reason on the side.
That good faith part really sets up the drama, doesn't it? And Alyeska seems like the perfect storm for seeing how alleged malice can just blow up an otherwise legitimate business defense. Let's really get into this story. Let's analyze Alyeska Pipeline Service Company via Aurora Air Service. First, what are the legally dispositive facts? What actually happened that mattered to the court?
Okay, the key players. Alyeska, the big boss running the pipeline project. They hired RCA for communication stuff. That contract required RCA to arrange transportation. So RCA then subcontracts with Aurora Air Service for a plane, a Cessna 207, and crucially, that RCA Aurora contract had Article 13, the optional termination clause for RCA. Now, the backstory is important. Alyeska and Aurora, they had history, a previous contract, a payment dispute. Aurora actually sued Alyeska to get paid shortly before all this went down.
The plot thickens.
Yeah.
And what happened right after Aurora filed that lawsuit?
Well, Alyeska paid up pretty much immediately after the suit was filed. But then very shortly after that, like in October 1975, Alyeska used its own contract right with RCA to just take over all the transportation requirements itself, cut RCA out of arranging it. And because Alyeska did that, RCA then turned around and used its optional termination clause on Aurora. Poof, Aurora's contract was gone. The timing, as you said, looks interesting.
Yeah, interesting is one word for it. Definitely paints a picture suggesting retaliation. So, given that sequence lawsuit, quick payment, immediate operational change, cutting Aurora out, what was the core legal issue the appeals court had to decide?
The main issue was pretty focused. Was Alyeska legally liable for intentionally interfering with that Aurora RCA contract? Specifically, did they induce RCA to terminate it without acting in good faith, even though they were technically exercising a right from their own contract with RCA?
Okay. And what rule did the court apply when looking at whether Alyeska's contractual right gave them sort of absolute immunity here?
The court laid down a clear rule. Alyeska's right to change its operations under the RCA contract was not absolute. It wasn't a blank check. Even though the right was there in black and white, it still had to be exercised in good faith. They completely rejected Alyeska's argument that just having the contractual right meant they could use it however they wanted, regardless of, spite or wanting revenge.
Let's zero in on that motive piece.
Right.
Alyeska did have legitimate business reasons, right? Safety, efficiency on this massive pipeline. How did the court's analysis weigh those potentially valid interests against the suspicion of bad faith or malice?
Well, the court said the core of the analysis boiled down to a question of fact for the jury. Was Alyeska really trying to further its economic and safety goals? Or was that just, a convenient excuse, a facade to hide the real goal, hurting Aurora because they were mad about the previous lawsuit? Since the evidence pointed both ways, Alyeska saying safety first, Aurora saying they're getting back at us, the court said, yep, that's exactly what juries are for. They hear the evidence, they decide what the dominant motive was, and in this case, the jury listened and decided, yeah, Alyeska was acting out of ill will.
And the conclusion? What was the final outcome?
The conclusion was that the lower court's judgment was upheld. The jury's verdict finding Alyeska liable for, I think it was around $362,901 stood. So it was legally established. Alyeska had intentionally interfered with the Aurora RCA contract, and they did it without justification because their primary motive was improper.
This really brings up a super common issue in business, right? Mixed motives. Let's say Alyeska did have some valid economic reason to take over transportation, maybe save some money or streamline things, but they also really disliked Aurora and wanted to stick it to them. How does the law handle that mix? It's just a little bit of bad motive enough to lose the privilege.
That's where this concept of predominant purpose becomes so critical. The court really leaned on this idea, drawing from legal scholars like Prosser. If your motive is purely malicious, like just pure spite, okay, that definitely kills any privilege. But with mixed motives, the court has to figure out what was the main driver, what was the predominant reason. If the defendant's main goal was a legitimate business objective, the fact that they also felt some ill will, maybe even enjoyed the outcome for the plaintiff, that usually won't destroy the privilege. But, flip side. If the predominant purpose was actually to injure the plaintiff, then the privilege is lost, even if there was some minor, maybe plausible business benefit on the side. It's about what truly drove the decision.
That distinction is huge. Okay, let's talk procedure for a second, the burden of proof. Alyeska tried to argue something interesting. They said, look, once we show our contract with RCA clearly gave us the right to make this change, the burden should flip back to Aurora. Aurora should then have to prove we acted maliciously. Why didn't the court buy that argument?
Right. Alyeska wanted to shift the burden back, but the court stuck to the established Alaska rule on this. It works like this. The plaintiff, Aurora in this case, just needs to make a basic prima facie case. Show that the breach or termination was intentionally caused by the defendant. Once Aurora does that, boom, the burden immediately shifts to the defendant, Alyeska, to prove they had justification for their actions.
So Alyeska showing they had a contractual right wasn't enough on its own to meet that burden of justification. It didn't automatically prove they were justified.
Exactly. Pointing to the contract clause was part of their justification argument. Sure, it showed they had a basis for acting. But the court said the whole question of good faith or the lack of it, the evidence of ulterior motive, goes directly to whether that justification is legally valid. Alyeska had the burden to prove they were justified overall. And the evidence suggesting their predominant motive was ill will. That directly undermined their claim of justification. They couldn't just point to the contract and say, okay, plaintiff, now you prove we were bad. The burden stayed with Alyeska to show they acted properly.
Okay, this whole analysis gives us a really clear roadmap. So let's synthesize this. For you, the listener, maybe facing an exam question or analyzing a real-world business dispute involving potential interference, what's the actionable checklist?
Yeah.
How do you step through this, applying what we learned from Alyeska?
All right, let's build a diagnostic checklist. This really focuses on how the defendant's claimed rights and their actual motives interact, especially when there is a contractual right involved like Alyeska had. Based on Alyeska, here are the steps, the questions you asked. Step 1, intentional procurement, first things first. Did the defendant actually intentionally cause the breach or the termination of the contract? And remember, this counts even if the contract was terminable at will. Simple causation. Step 2, prima facie case. Okay, if the answer to step 1 is yes, then the plaintiff has made their initial case. The burden immediately shifts to the defendant. Plaintiff rests for now. Step 3, justification privilege test. Now the spotlight's on the defendant. Can they point to some superior interest? Something socially important, maybe their own economic survival, public safety, managing a critical project that seems, on its face, to justify their interference. Step 4, good faith predominant purpose test. And here's the Alyeska kicker. Even if they showed a potential justification in step 3, did they exercise that privilege in good faith? You have to look at the evidence. If it shows the defendant's predominant purpose, the main reason for acting, was actually to injure the plaintiff, then that privilege is gone, forfeited. Doesn't matter if they had a contractual right on paper.
That framework is super helpful. It really distills the core logic, and the big takeaway seems crystal clear. Just having a contractual right, like Alyeska's right to manage its operations, it's never like a magic shield if your real reason for using that right is retaliation or bad blood.
Exactly right. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the law wants to encourage fair competition. Sure, it wants businesses to manage their affairs, but it draws a really sharp line. It won't let a powerful entity use a perfectly valid legal right as just a weapon, a cover for settling scores or acting out of pure malice, especially when it harms a smaller business that relies on that relationship.
So for you, the listener, here's something to chew on. Alyeska was building Trans-Alaska Pipeline. A project of immense national importance, huge economic stakes. How should a court really weigh that? The massive, maybe even essential needs of a giant corporation to control its entire supply chain versus the need to protect a little guy like Aurora from just being wiped out because somebody upstairs holds a grudge. Finding that balance, well, that's something worth mulling over.